So our friends at SOMA sent over the Fogcutter so I could build it up to help test drivetrains for our peak mechanical series. But in the process, it has actually made it into heavy rotation and has become one of my favorite bikes this past year. So the Fogcutter is SOMA's endurance road bike with disc brakes. It's made with Tanjay Prestige double-bedded tubing and comes in two options. You can get a paint-matched straight blade carbon fork, or the fork I got, which is a lug steel fork with mid-fork eyelets. One interesting note is that if you do go the carbon fork route, it has an alloy steerer, which allows the use of up to 16 millimeters of spacers safely. This is actually a really nice touch that a lot of brands don't even think of. Again, one of the reasons I love working with SOMA and Mary Sales is they have practicality in mind for the average cyclist. Why this is important is that this sort of makes up for the lowest stack height on the bike. If you don't slam your stem and want to get your bars higher and use a carbon fork, you can do it with this bike. Talking about practicality, the bike has eyelets for fenders and racks. So although it has roadish geometry, it doesn't lack utility in the process. It can also be built up with down tube shifters. That's right. 2024, you can still have down tube shifters on the bike. So if you want to go ultra simple and lightweight. Another big plus is that the cable routing is external for simple maintenance and setup. By all accounts, this is a pretty basic bike, which is becoming more and more rare these days. The bike actually has pretty good tire clearance for its geometry, so you can do 700 by 38 with fenders, about 740 without, or you could even do 650B by 43 millimeters. I built up the bike in a few different ways. The first was with some 700 by 38 Rene Erst tires attached to the nice Ritchie Zeta Disc Classic wheelset that comes in silver. Again, another rarity these days. On those rims, the tires actually measured closer to 40 millimeters. You can kind of think of it as a super chubby road bike in this configuration. In its current state, I'm actually running 700 by 35 Rene Erst tires, SKS fenders, and a front rack by Align Components and a bag by Graham Tour Packing. It's winter here in Spain and we're getting a fair amount of rain, and I just wanted a fully fendered bike that could ride without getting my back wet or my feet wet. So it's kind of winter rando mode. The handlebars are one of my favorite, very comfy and wide Ritchie VentureMax. In terms of the drivetrain, I'm using the Tiagra 4700 shifters, which are 10 speed, but they use 11 speed cable pull. So that means you can use it with Shimano 105 11 speed, or more importantly, you can use it with the very excellent Shimano GRX 810 rear derailleur. For the front derailleur, because I am running it 2x, I am using the Microshift Sword front derailleur, and there appears to be no incompatibility between that and the Tiagra shifters. My initial buildup with the bike, I was running it with some Sword cranks, 4630 in the front. In the rear, I have an 11 to 42, I think it's a Dior cassette in 10 speeds. And with the GRX 810 rear derailleur, it covers that range beautifully, shifts nice and crisp with no modifications whatsoever. So on this bike and other bikes I've tried, actually, you don't need to run a cable extender hanger tab thing. It just works natively out of the box. So 1142 definitely exceeds the stated range of the GRX 810 rear derailleur, but in the multiple bikes I've tried it, it works good. 4630 in the front, 1142 in the rear. I have since switched the crankset to our prototype alt crank. So these cranks have a 110/74 direct mount spider, and on that spider we've got some 42/26 rings. This is kind of my favorite all-rounder steep terrain carrying stuff gearing. And the cranks use a 24 millimeter Shimano compatible spindle. More on the cranks later, but all that to say, it still shifts well. I'm using the original Microshift front rear derailleur that they designed in mind with a 4630, but it shifts the 42/26 just fine. Although the curvature of the front derailleur doesn't match the chain rings, doesn't seem to affect the shifting at all. I think that's one of the dirty secrets about front derailleurs is there's a lot more margin for making things work than you would previously think. Moving on, the stoppers are of course some Paul clampers. Like I mentioned, the wheels are silver classic Zetas from Ritchie. They are tubeless compatible, but in the 8 months that I've been running the bike, I've actually been using tubes. Specifically the Rene Erst TPU tubes that have been surprisingly robust. I did have one puncture a few months ago, but I patched it up with their TPU patch kit, and it's held air ever since, which is, I think, a pretty good testament to the tubes and their patch kit. So for sizing, I'm 5'8", 29-inch inseam, so a little bit on the shorter side of the spectrum. I would have preferred a size 52, but that size doesn't exist in the Fogcutter. In this instance, I decided to size down to 51, and the fit is generally good. I think I could also have ridden a size 54, but I was being a little bit conservative in my guess this time. That is one nice thing about the steel fork. It gives me a lot of confidence to run the steer a little bit higher so I can get the bars about where I want them without worrying that they're going to snap off because they've got like a carbon steer or something. In terms of geometry, the bike is pretty standard roadish geometry. The trail is 59, so it's in that mid-neutral handling category. Just to give you a frame of reference, my Sklar Super something, I believe the trail in that is in the upper 70s. It's a lot more stable handling with the Sklar. The chainstays are relatively short on this guy at 422. The stack height isn't very tall, so if you run your bars even with your saddle, it might be a bit of a challenge. But of course, like I mentioned, there is a steel fork option that helps facilitate that. That would probably be my only complaint geometry-wise. I like the numbers in terms of handling, but I do wish the stack was a little bit more generous, but you can't have it all. So the bike, as you see it with pedals, cages, and not particularly weight-weenie parts, builds out to about 25 pounds, which, you know, I don't think is too bad. You could spend more to get the weight down by going with the carbon fork. You know, lighter wheel set's gonna make a huge difference. And I think a bike weight closer to 20 pounds is definitely achievable. Okay, so how does the bike ride and where does it fit in the stable? It probably won't be too much of a surprise, but it rides like an endurance road bike. The short rear end at 422 feels really good with out of the saddle efforts. If you like that jumpy, punchy feeling. The steering is typical neutral road handling, so leans more towards the responsive side of things, especially when you compare it to something like the Sklar Super something, which has a slacker head tube angle and higher trail. I think despite its weight, it feels good while climbing and accelerates well. And again, I attribute that to the shorter rear and the shorter wheelbase. Descending on pavement, it picks up speed really well, and it's nice and responsive like any other endurance road bike. On chunkier gravel, which I have taken it on, I take things a little bit more mellow. For me personally, that is where a bike like the Super something excels with its higher trail that holds its line better when things get rough. The Fogcutter, no surprise, is a bit more sensitive to being spanked around when you're going on the grab. Can it ride gravel? Definitely, depending on tire choice and your handling skills and the nature of the gravel. Probably not the best if your version of gravel is single track, but if you ride champagne gravel, pea-sized gravel, hero gravel, then this is an awesome bike for that. Okay, so where does this bike fit in 2024? If it feels like a normal road bike, why get it then? Well, I think in a day and age when road bikes are all plastic and have internal routing and carbon forks and really aggressive geometry, where you have limited height adjustability, the Fogcutter in a lot of ways is a welcome breath of fresh air. I think this is a bike that's easy to take for granted, but when I was looking for a bike to use for peak mechanical here in Spain, it was hard to find just like a basic externally routed road bike that takes disc brakes and modern standards, I should add. So while it looks vintage, it is compliant to modern standards with through axles, flat mount disc brakes, all that good stuff. Probably the bike the Fogcutter reminds me the most of is the Surly Midnight Special. It's got a very close rear end and trail number, similar-ish tire clearance, although the Midnight Special does have a bit more room. Both have good utility, but the Fogcutter does have a carbon fork option if that's what you want to do, and it fully commits to the through axle standard. None of this like halfway through axle, halfway quick release. Another bike you might compare it to is the now defunct Space Horse. That bike, however, has higher trail. The Space Horse, in comparison, is more of like a light tourer, and the Fogcutter is more of like a fat tire-ish road bike. Compared to the other bike I tested recently, which is similar, the Richie Montebello, its handling is a little bit sharper and spicier and more road bike-like, whereas the Richie is a little bit more relaxed. The flip side is the Richie did build up a little bit lighter, probably due to the carbon fork and maybe the butting profile. For me, when I think Montebello, I think smooth. With the Fogcutter, I think a little bit quicker and slightly sharper handling. So again, the Fogcutter feels more like a burlier, fat-tired road bike, and the Montebello a little bit more like a Svelter polyvalent. Overall, I'm really enjoying the Fogcutter for a bike that was meant to be the platform for Cave of Bad Ideas testing. It has become one of my favorite bikes to ride here in Spain. It's got the zippiness of a road bike, but doesn't lack in utility, so you can put racks on it if you want, fenders if you want. Probably the biggest downside for some perhaps would be the weight. It does build up a little bit heavier, but honestly, if you're a weight weenie, if you're that kind of road cyclist, then you're probably going to end up with a different kind of bike. At the end of the day, I see it as a nicer option to the Midnight Special, especially if you like a lugged fork rather than kind of the plumbing Unicrown. In some ways, it replaces a void that All City has left for a nice, like, good handling, good value, but practical bike. That's what I think of the SOMA Fogcutter. What do you guys think? If you guys enjoyed this review, please consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon or picking up some merch. We've got some new stuff. We've got some new casual hats in the store, as well as stickers and new shirts. Every bit helps. Again, we're not getting checks in the mail from big bike brands or anything. We're largely viewer supported by people like you. So as always, keep the supple side down.